So guys, have you walked down the baking aisle recently at the grocery store and seen, honestly, half of it, like one whole side, is just different types of flour? Of course, we have all-purpose flour, whole wheat flour, we have soft flour, hard flour, and you could probably go on and on. So what do we use these different types of flour for, or what even makes them different? Well, that's what I want to talk about today. Now, this video is only going to focus on flours made from wheat or from the wheat kernel. I know in the grocery store there's like every kind of flour now. We have almond flour, buckwheat flour, oat flour, flour from everything. But there's so many types of flours just from wheat. That's what this is going to focus on. So any wheat flour is made from the wheat kernel. And this wheat kernel is made up of 3 different parts. We have the bran, germ, and endosperm. Now, each of these parts is composed of different nutrients. For example, the bran, or that outer coating, sort of a protective layer, the bran is rich in fiber and antioxidants, whereas the endosperm, which is that large part, the endosperm is really high in carbohydrates. And the germ, so the germ is actually the seedling, that is a good source of fats and oils. Now, any flours made from wheat or this wheat kernel, some of them include all 3 parts of the wheat kernel. So it has the bran, germ, and endosperm, but others are composed of just the endosperm. Let's start with the most common type of flour, and that's all-purpose flour. Now, even if you don't bake a lot, this is the type of flour you have in your kitchen just laying around. And that's because, like the name implies, this flour can be used to bake just about everything. It makes a decent bread, it makes decent cookies, decent cakes, it's for everything. And all-purpose flour, composition-wise, it's made from the endosperm of the wheat kernel. Remember, that was really carbohydrate rich. But what is great about this composition is that it gives a very balanced protein content. So all-purpose flour is about 10 to 12% protein. And this protein in wheat is called gluten, which really affects the texture of what we're baking. Understanding what gluten or this wheat protein is doing in your bread or any other baked good is really important if you want to get the right texture. Now, usually with gluten, we divide it into 2 more specific proteins called gliadin and glutenin. And the one I really want to focus on is that glutenin. Glutenin is a protein with a really specialized structure. So it has this spiral portion in the center, and that can act like an accordion. It can expand and contract, where the 2 ends of glutenin each are more of a linear structure, or these squiggles. And the end portions can actually cross-link with other glutenin molecules. So as you have more and more glutenin present, say in a dough, you see more of this cross-linking and linking up of these different glutenin proteins, which eventually forms a protein network. And it's this protein network that can trap in the gas bubbles produced by yeast or other starch granules. And it can get strong enough to trap in all these other food particles and hold the dough together. Now, what you'd see with a high protein content with a lot of glutenin, you get a really strong protein network, and you can see your dough stretch and contract. Okay, let's move on to another big type of flour, and that's whole wheat flour. So when you see whole wheat, what that is telling you is that all 3 parts of the wheat kernel must be included in this flour. So whereas all-purpose just had the endosperm included, whole wheat means it includes the endosperm, bran, and germ. Now, this can usually be very bad for the texture of whatever you're baking, and that's because we're adding extra things in that sort of disrupt that gluten network. But it can be really good from a nutrition standpoint. So by adding the bran in, that was the protective outer layer of the wheat kernel, that adds more fiber into our flour, so that's good. And the germ has some fats, vitamins, and minerals. So from a nutrition standpoint, whole wheat flour has a lot of benefits, but from sort of a texture and, how good something tastes, often whole wheat flour, the bran makes it kind of like crunchy and this more brown color. And the texture becomes sort of compact and chewy. And again, that's because that protein network, that gluten network is being disrupted by all these sort of extra components from the bran and germ. Moving on to bread flour, which you also might see it be called hard flour or strong flour. And what all these terms mean is this type of flour has a higher than average gluten content. So usually it's about 12.5 to 13.5% protein. And so this makes a very strong gluten network, right? Because remember, all those little gluten proteins are going to link up and make a very strong network in these baked goods. So what we would use hard flour for is things like bread and pizza crust, because that strong gluten network will make these products very bouncy and have a springy texture. Let's move on to flour that's labeled cake flour or soft flour. They mean the same things. And this type of flour has a low protein content, usually only 7 to 9% protein, which makes a really weak or soft gluten network. So you would want to use this type of flour if you're making, cakes, cookies, or crackers, the type of baked goods that have a short texture or a very fine and tender texture. And that's because this flour won't really develop a strong gluten network. It has a very weak protein network. Now, one other type of flour that I see every once in a while in the grocery store is called self-rising flour. And this is actually a mixture of a couple things. Obviously, flour, baking soda, and acid and salt. Really, the only recipes I've seen call for self-rising flour are biscuits. And typically these recipes, they know that the salt and the baking soda is already in the flour, so they wouldn't call for any more in the recipe. All right, I want to touch on one other thing you might see in that flour section of your grocery store, and that's durum wheat. Now, durum wheat is actually an entire different wheat species than all the flours we just talked about. So durum wheat comes from Triticum durum, which makes sense. But the flours we already talked about, these come from a different wheat species called Triticum vulgare. So the only reason we really like durum wheat is it has a super high protein content, which makes it great for making noodles and pasta, but that's just about it. That's what we use, durum wheat for. You might see it labeled as semolina. Now, semolina refers to just the endosperm portion of durum wheat. So we mill durum wheat and sort of the endosperm breaks off in these uniform fragments, and that's what's known as semolina. So if you're a big baker, hopefully this helped clear a couple of things up, like the main differences of why you might want a strong protein network or a weak protein network for different things like bread or cake or cookies. And if this was helpful to you, please give this video a thumbs up and hit that red subscribe button to get more updates from my channel. Talk to you next time.